Hey there. So, you send over some really interesting stuff on inequality.
Uh-huh.
We're going to be taking a deep dive, especially into Thomas Piketty's Capital in the 21st century.
Okay.
And we even have some excerpts from a discussion that happened at CUNY Graduate Center. Um, it's clear that you're really trying to get to the core of this. And trust me, this stuff is relevant no matter where you fall on the economic spectrum.
Yeah. I think what's really compelling about Piketty's work is that he doesn't just like throw data at you, right?
Yeah.
He's really looking at connecting economic history, social trends, even weaving in things like insights from literature
Wow.
to give us this really kind of holistic picture of where inequality has been and where it might be heading.
Yeah, it's wild. Like, he and his team built this massive database going back like over a century.
Yeah.
And they're using things like tax records to really track the ultra-wealthy in a way that, surveys just can't.
Right. And one of the most striking findings is what they call this U-shaped curve of inequality in the 20th century. Okay.
So you see this dramatic drop mid-century, which led some economists to think, oh, inequality just naturally decreases as societies develop.
Right.
But then, boom, it shoots back up.
Okay, so how does he explain this?
So he argues that a major factor is the difference between what he calls R, which is the rate of return on capital,
Okay.
and G, which is the economic growth rate.
Okay.
And the idea is that when R is higher than G, existing wealth grows faster than the overall economy.
So those who already have capital are pulling further and further ahead.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So you get this concentration of wealth at the top. Now, this raises the question of why was R lower than G for a period?
Right.
And Piketty attributes it to, well, think about the 20th century. It's a century of massive disruptions.
Yeah.
World wars, the Great Depression.
Yeah.
These events wiped out huge amounts of capital.
Yeah.
Plus, you had high population growth, which boosted the overall growth rate. So for a while there, it seemed like things were evening out, but it sounds like maybe that was just a blip.
That's what Piketty thinks, yeah.
Okay.
He argues that without those massive shocks to the system, R naturally tends to be higher than G,
Okay.
especially in places with slow economic growth.
Okay.
So think about much of Europe, Japan today.
Right, right.
So this is where his idea of patrimonial capitalism comes in.
Good.
So these are societies where inherited wealth plays a dominant role. Go back to those classic novels like Jane Austen or Balzac,
Right.
where owning land was everything.
Right.
He's suggesting we might be heading back in that direction.
It's so interesting because you think about, the U.S. and this whole idea of, the American dream.
Right.
Like rags to riches, hard work and talent being the great equalizers.
Right. That's the ideal.
Yeah.
But the data suggests that the U.S. is actually on track to become more unequal than those old money societies of the past.
Right.
We already have income inequality on par with pre-World War I Europe.
Wow.
And, the rise of what he calls the supermanager class,
Yeah.
these folks who are earning astronomical salaries and bonuses,
Right.
is really contributing to this trend.
Wow. That's pretty sobering.
Hmm.
So if this keeps going, what does Piketty say we should do?
He's not just sounding the alarm, he's actually offering some solutions.
Okay.
And one of his most controversial is a global progressive tax on wealth.
Okay.
So, it's certainly a bold idea.
Yeah.
And one that has sparked a lot of debate.
It might sound radical to some, but, the U.S. does have a history of progressive taxation. I mean, think about those high tax rates on top earners back in the mid-20th century.
Exactly right. And they didn't exactly destroy American capitalism,
Right. Yeah.
In fact, that period saw strong economic growth, and we actually saw the gap between the rich and the poor narrow.
So, I mean, it shows that policies can make a difference. So, Piketty really focuses on this return on capital versus, economic growth.
Yeah.
But are there other kind of, important pieces to this puzzle?
Absolutely. And, other experts have weighed in on this. For instance, Joseph Stiglitz, he highlights that inequality has many roots, right? It's not just this one thing.
Right.
And, he argues, for instance, that the idea of wages being directly tied to one's contribution to society,
Okay.
which is known as marginal productivity, has been largely debunked.
Oh, interesting. So somebody could be, wildly overpaid,
Yeah.
even if they're not really contributing that much.
Precisely.
Yeah.
And, he points to the 2008 financial crisis
Oh, yeah.
as a prime example. Many bankers who played a role in the crisis still received these massive bonuses even as the economy was tanking.
Yeah. It does make you wonder about that whole, those at the top deserve their wealth
Right.
argument.
It certainly challenges that notion. And he also emphasizes that things like discrimination, lack of access to education, even things like corporate lobbying that skews regulations in favor of the wealthy.
Right.
All of these play a part in perpetuating inequality.
So it's not just about individual effort or talent. It's about, like, the system itself can be kind of tilted. Right?
Exactly. And this brings us back to Piketty's point about inherited wealth versus earned wealth.
Right.
He's arguing that we're seeing a shift towards a more patrimonial form of capitalism where inherited wealth plays a greater role, even in a country like the U.S. that prides itself on meritocracy.
It sounds like we might be heading back to, like, those Downton Abbey societies
Right.
where family fortunes determine your destiny.
Mm-hmm.
But didn't we just say that the U.S. was becoming even more unequal than those old societies?
That's the fascinating paradox.
Yeah.
And this is a key point of Piketty's book.
Right.
He's arguing that inherited wealth is becoming increasingly important, even more so than in those old money societies.
Right.
In the U.S., we often think of ourselves as a meritocracy, but the data suggests that inherited advantages are playing a larger and larger role.
Wow. So while Europe might be, stuck in its old ways, the U.S. is finding new and innovative ways to concentrate wealth at the top.
You could say that.
Yeah.
And this raises some serious questions about social mobility in the U.S. If inherited wealth is becoming so dominant, what does that mean for people who are born without those advantages? Is the American dream even attainable anymore?
Okay, so we've established that Piketty believes inherited wealth is a big problem, even more so in the U.S. than in, those old world societies we might imagine. But how exactly does that happen? How does that wealth get passed down and concentrated over generations?
Well, one of the key mechanisms that he identifies is, again, that R factor, that rate of return on capital.
Right.
It often outpaces the overall economic growth rate.
Right, so the rich get richer faster than everyone else.
Yeah.
But we also talked about how there was this period in the 20th century when that wasn't the case. For a while, R was actually lower than G. Why did that happen?
Piketty attributes this to, again, those major 20th century shocks, the World Wars and the Great Depression.
Right.
These events wiped out, a significant amount of capital and led to policies that, favored higher economic growth. So it was almost like hitting a reset button, at least temporarily.
But if those shocks are what caused that temporary shift, where does that leave us now?
That's exactly what concerns Piketty. He argues that without those shocks, R tends to be higher than G, especially in these slower growing economies. So, think about places like Japan, much of Europe, where economic growth has been pretty sluggish for decades now.
Right.
In those contexts, inherited wealth can become a really dominant force, right?
Yeah.
Shaping everything from social status to political power.
It's starting to sound a bit like a dystopian novel,
Right.
where your family's wealth determines your entire destiny. Is that really where we're headed?
It's a real possibility and, something we need to consider seriously. And remember, Piketty's book, it's not just about data points, right?
Right.
It's about challenging our assumptions about wealth creation and distribution.
Yeah. And he doesn't shy away from, suggesting solutions,
Yeah.
even if they are a little controversial.
Right.
We talked about, his idea of a global progressive tax on wealth.
Uh-huh.
It's a big idea. And I'm guessing it has its critics.
Absolutely. It's a bold proposal. But what's interesting is that he points to the United States' own history with progressive taxation.
Right.
During the mid-20th century, the U.S. had very high tax rates on top earners.
Right.
And it didn't destroy American capitalism.
That's right. And those high tax rates coincided with strong economic growth and a shrinking gap between the rich and the poor.
Exactly.
Makes you wonder what might be possible today.
It does raise some interesting questions, right? It shows that policy choices can have a dramatic impact on inequality. It's not inevitable that wealth will just continue to concentrate in the hands of a select few.
So it's not just about economics. It's about our values and the kind of society we choose to create.
Exactly.
Okay, that's a lot to think about.
Mm.
But how does all of this historical data and theory connect to, like, the world we live in today?
Right.
You mentioned other experts weighing in on Piketty's work. What are some of those additional insights?
So one key point is that while Piketty focuses on the rate of return on capital, there are, of course, many other factors that contribute to inequality.
Right.
Think about things like corporate governance rules, financial regulations, even intellectual property laws.
Yeah.
All of these can play a role in shaping how wealth is distributed.
So it's not just about taxing wealth. It's about designing like the rules of the game to be fair.
Exactly. And these experts also emphasize the crucial role of technology. Right. The way technology evolves can either exacerbate inequality or create opportunities for greater equality.
That's a great point. Depending on how we develop and use technology, we could end up in a world where a few tech giants control everything, or we could use it to empower more people and create a more equitable society.
Precisely. And those choices are being made right now.
Yeah.
It's not just some distant future. It's about the decisions we're making today.
And speaking of choices, some economists have also highlighted the impact of like how we structure our education system.
Absolutely right.
Yeah.
If we truly want a more equitable society, everyone needs access to quality education, regardless of their background or family income.
Right.
Investing in education isn't just about individual advancement, it's about creating a more just and equitable society.
So it's not just about economics, it's about our values
Yeah.
and the kind of future we want to build.
Exactly. And that brings us back to Piketty's core argument, right?
Yeah.
Inequality is not inevitable. It's a consequence of the choices we make as a society. But it's important to remember that not everyone agrees with Piketty's conclusions.
Right. Okay.
There are different perspectives on these issues.
So even with all this evidence and analysis, there's still room for debate.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
For example, some economists argue that Piketty underestimates the role of technological innovation in driving economic growth and creating new opportunities.
Okay.
They might point to examples like, the rise of the internet,
Right.
which has created all these new avenues for entrepreneurship and wealth creation for people from all walks of life.
So the argument is that new technologies can actually help to reduce inequality.
That's one perspective, yeah.
Okay.
However, others would argue that, the benefits of those innovations are often concentrated among a small group of highly skilled workers and investors.
Right.
Right, so it highlights the fact that there's no easy answer when it comes to inequality.
Yeah.
It's a complex issue
Yeah.
with many contributing factors.
So while Piketty's work is incredibly insightful, it's important to remember that it's part of a larger conversation,
Exactly.
a debate that's still unfolding.
Right, and that's why it's so important to consider different perspectives, weigh the evidence carefully, and have these open and honest discussions about these issues.
Well, before we dive into some of the specific historical examples that Piketty uses to kind of illustrate his arguments, let's take a quick pause.
Oh.
We'll be back in a moment to continue our deep dive into this fascinating topic.
So, before the break, we were talking about technology and how it can be a double-edged sword when it comes to inequality.
Right, yeah.
It can create opportunities, but it can also exacerbate existing disparities.
Right.
And this ties into a fascinating question that was actually posed to Piketty
Okay.
during that CUNY Graduate Center event that we keep mentioning.
Yeah.
One of the experts there, Branko Milanovic,
Okay.
asked Piketty to kind of compare the image of patrimonial capitalism, Europe around 1914, dominated by inherited wealth.
Right. With the current situation in the U.S.,
Mm.
where inequality is also high, but driven more by labor income.
Okay, so the super managers we were talking about.
Exactly. And, he wanted to know, did Piketty see any difference in the political implications or even potential policy responses?
That's a really interesting question. Like, does the source of inequality really matter when it comes to the consequences?
That's a good question.
Yeah.
And, interestingly, Piketty didn't really offer a definitive answer.
Okay.
Instead, he emphasized the importance of historical context
Okay.
and the power of persuasion
Oh, okay.
in shaping how societies respond to inequality.
So it's not just about the numbers. It's about how we frame those numbers,
No.
the stories we tell ourselves about why inequality exists.
Exactly. And, he pointed out that throughout history, political leaders, elites, have often used persuasion
Right?
and sometimes, even repression
Yeah.
to justify inequality,
Wow.
to maintain their power. Kind of unsettling, this idea that inequality isn't just like an economic reality, but it can be perpetuated through manipulating information and public perception.
Right. It really highlights the power of narratives.
Yeah.
I mean, think about it. If you're constantly being told that, the wealthy deserve their fortunes or that inequality is just the natural order of things, you might be less inclined to question the system.
Right, right. Makes you think about the role of the media, education, even just like cultural norms in shaping how we view inequality and whether we're willing to challenge it.
Absolutely.
So are we just doomed to accept whatever level of inequality those in power decide is acceptable?
Well, not necessarily. Piketty also pointed out that in the 20th century, major events like the World Wars, the Great Depression, these had a profound impact on attitudes toward inequality.
Right.
I mean, those events were so disruptive, so catastrophic.
Yeah.
They really forced people to kind of reevaluate their assumptions about how society should be structured. It exposed the flaws in the existing economic order and created a sense of, shared sacrifice and solidarity. And they opened up space for new ideas and policies that might not have been possible during, times of stability.
And I mean, those new ideas often came from social movements,
Yeah.
right? Like groups that were pushing for greater equality and social justice.
Absolutely. I mean, think about the labor movement, the civil rights movement, the women's rights movement.
Right.
All of these movements were challenging the status quo and pushing for a fairer society.
And it wasn't just about like economic arguments. I mean, these movements often tapped into like deeply held moral values, like a sense of what's right and wrong.
Absolutely. I mean, it's about appealing to our sense of fairness, our belief in human dignity. And, sometimes dry economic data can't do that. You need the power of stories, personal experiences to really move people to action.
Okay, so we have these historical events, we have these social movements. Any other factors that can kind of shift public opinion and create momentum for change?
Well, we were talking about the role of technology earlier.
Right, yeah.
And that can really be a wild card.
Right.
It can cut both ways. It can create new opportunities for wealth creation, but it can also lead to, job displacement and a widening gap between the highly skilled and everyone else.
It seems like technology often accelerates whatever trend is already happening in the society. So if we're leaning toward greater equality, technology can help. But if we're already unequal, technology just makes things worse.
That's a good way to put it. And this highlights why it's so crucial to have these open and honest conversations about technology's impact.
Yeah.
Right? We need to ensure that the benefits of technology are shared broadly, not just concentrated among a select few.
Okay, so technology, what else?
Climate change is increasingly recognized as a factor that could really significantly impact inequality.
Oh, that's interesting. I hadn't really connected those two issues before.
Yeah, it's a complex relationship. But there's growing awareness that climate change will likely worsen existing inequalities, both within and between countries.
Okay, so how does that work? How does climate change make inequality worse?
Well, climate change is likely to disproportionately affect the poor and vulnerable.
Okay.
Right? They often live in areas that are most susceptible to, the effects of climate change, things like droughts, floods, extreme weather events.
And they're also less likely to have the resources to, relocate or adapt to those changing conditions.
Exactly. And think about those who rely on agriculture or other climate-sensitive industries for their livelihoods.
Yeah.
They're really on the front lines of climate change's impacts.
Right.
And, the World Bank estimates that by 2030, climate change could push over 100 million people into poverty.
Wow. It's almost like climate change is a threat multiplier that can make all of our existing problems even worse.
Exactly. And, these challenges will likely be felt most acutely in countries that are already grappling with poverty, inequality, weak governance.
Right. Yeah. Okay. So we have technology, climate change. What other factors might shape the future of inequality?
Well, demographics are often overlooked.
Right.
But they can play a significant role.
Wow.
So things like population growth, aging populations, migration patterns,
Yeah.
all of these have an impact. So, for example, in countries with rapidly aging populations like Japan, many European nations,
Right.
you might see a growing gap between the working age population and the elderly,
Yeah.
which can strain social safety nets and exacerbate generational inequalities.
It makes sense. If there are fewer young people working and paying taxes, it's harder to fund programs like pensions and health care for the elderly.
Precisely. On the flip side, in countries with, rapid population growth,
Right.
particularly in parts of Africa and Asia, we often see increased competition for jobs, resources, opportunities, potentially leading to greater inequality.
So demographic trends can either kind of help mitigate inequality or make it worse, depending on how they're managed.
Exactly. That's why policies that promote inclusive growth and ensure that everyone has access to opportunities, regardless of age or background, are so important.
Right.
Right? It's not just about economic growth, it's about how the benefits of that growth are shared.
It's interesting. We've been talking a lot about wealth and income inequality. But, during that CUNY event, several experts, including Joseph Stiglitz, emphasized that we need to think more broadly about inequality.
Absolutely. He argued that we need to consider factors beyond just wealth and income.
Yeah.
Things like access to education, health care, opportunities for advancement.
So it's not just about how much money people have, it's about their ability to live a fulfilling life, reach their full potential.
That's Stiglitz's point. And he would say that inequality in these areas can be just as damaging as economic inequality. Lack of access to quality education can trap people in a cycle of poverty and really limit their options.
Right, and inadequate health care can lead to poor health, even premature death, especially for those already facing disadvantages.
Exactly. And beyond kind of basic needs, there's the question of social mobility.
Right.
Or the ability to move up the economic ladder. And Stiglitz pointed out that in the U.S., social mobility has actually declined in recent decades.
So even if we fix the wealth gap, if the system is still rigged against those born into, poverty or disadvantage, we're not really creating a fair society.
Exactly. It requires addressing those systemic barriers.
Yeah.
Discrimination, lack of access to capital, the concentration of power, that prevent people from reaching their full potential.
Yeah.
It's about creating a system that supports everyone's ability to succeed, regardless of their background.
Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground here. We've talked about how historical events and social movements can kind of shift attitudes toward inequality, the role of technology, climate change, demographics in shaping the future of this issue, and the importance of considering a broader definition of inequality that goes beyond just wealth and income.
Right. And as we move into the final part of our deep dive, we're going to explore one of the most, I think, concerning aspects of inequality,
Okay.
which is its potential impact on democracy itself.
This is where things get really interesting. We've talked about, the social and economic consequences of inequality, but this idea that it could undermine democracy, that really raises the stakes. We'll be back in a moment to discuss this in more detail. Okay, so we're back, and as you said, things are about to get a little heavy. Before the break, we were talking about how inequality isn't just an economic problem. It has this potential to really affect the foundations of a democratic society.
Right. And this was something that several experts at that CNY event, were really concerned about. They argued that extreme inequality can actually weaken democratic institutions
Okay.
and erode those principles of fairness and justice that those institutions are built on.
Okay, but how does that happen? How does inequality undermine democracy?
Well, think about it this way. When wealth is concentrated in the hands of a very small elite,
Yeah.
those individuals and the corporations that they control
Right.
often have an outsized influence on the political process.
Right.
We're talking about lobbyists, campaign contributions,
Right, yeah.
all those things that can, sway politicians to favor the interests of the wealthy, over the needs of everyone else.
Right. We've all heard those stories about how money talks in politics. But is it really that simple? I mean, don't voters ultimately have the power to choose their leaders?
Well, in theory, yes.
Yeah.
But when the playing field is tilted so dramatically in favor of the wealthy, it becomes much harder for ordinary citizens to actually have their voices heard. And so this kind of undue influence can distort policymaking,
Okay.
right? It can lead to laws and regulations that benefit the few at the expense of the many.
So it's like the system itself gets rigged
Exactly.
against those who don't have wealth and power.
And that can create a vicious cycle, right? Inequality leads to political corruption, which in turn leads to more inequality. And it becomes incredibly difficult to break out of that cycle.
It makes you wonder, if true democracy is even possible in a society with such extreme levels of inequality.
Yeah, it's a question that a lot of people are asking these days. And it's not just about the direct influence of money in politics, you
Yeah.
know?
Yeah.
It's also about the broader kind of social and cultural consequences of inequality. You know, when a society is highly unequal, people tend to live, work, socialize in very separate
Right.
spheres.
It's like we end up living in like different worlds almost
Exact.
with completely different experiences and priorities.
And that kind of social segregation, makes it much harder to build understanding, empathy, a sense of shared purpose
Right.
across those divides. So it becomes much harder to find common ground, to
Right.
solve problems together,
Right.
to create a society that works for everyone.
So even if we put aside the issue of like money influencing politics,
Uh-huh.
just the fact that people are living such different lives, based on their economic status,
Yeah.
can be a threat to democracy.
Absolutely. And that's why it's so important to think about inequality, not just as an economic problem,
Right.
but as a fundamental threat to the values, right,
Yeah.
of fairness, justice, equality that underpin a democratic society.
Okay, so we've established that inequality can be this serious threat to democracy. But can democracy, in turn, help to, mitigate inequality?
Yeah.
Can a functioning democracy help to create a more level playing field?
That's a great question. And, it's at the heart of a lot of debates
Yeah.
about the role of government in addressing inequality. Some people believe that the government should take a much more active role in, redistributing wealth and leveling the playing field.
Yeah.
So, they might support policies like universal health care, free college tuition, or even a guaranteed basic income.
Those are some pretty big ideas.
Right.
I imagine there's plenty of people who disagree with that approach.
Oh, of course. There are those who would argue that, these kinds of policies discourage hard work, stifle innovation, and ultimately harm the economy.
Right.
So they might favor, a more hands-off approach,
Okay.
believing that the best way to address inequality is to focus on economic growth and creating opportunities for everyone to succeed. You know that old saying, a rising tide lifts all boats.
Right, right. It sounds like, the classic debate about the role of government.
Right.
How do we balance, individual freedom with the need for social responsibility? How do we create a system that, encourages both individual initiative and collective well-being?
Exactly. And there's no easy answer. I mean, the right approach will depend on, the specific context and the values of a particular society. But it's a conversation we need to be having.
Yeah.
The stakes are high.
Well, speaking of conversations, I'm curious about, some of the specific policy solutions that were discussed at that CUNY event. We've talked about things like, progressive taxation, investments in education and healthcare, even a global wealth tax. What other ideas came up?
One that generated a lot of discussion was the concept of a guaranteed basic income. So this is the idea of providing everyone with a regular, unconditional cash payment,
Okay.
regardless of their income or employment status.
Right. I've heard about that. It sounds like a pretty radical idea.
It's a bold proposal for sure. But the interesting thing is, it's not just a theoretical concept anymore.
Okay.
There have actually been a number of pilot programs
Really?
around the world
Wow.
that have tested this idea of a guaranteed basic income. And the results have been pretty promising.
So there's actually some evidence to suggest that this could work.
There is. And it's an idea that's gaining traction, particularly as more people become concerned about the potential for job displacement,
Right.
due to automation.
Yeah.
If machines start doing more and more of the work that humans used to do,
Right.
we may need to rethink how we provide for people's basic needs.
And a guaranteed basic income could be a way to, address that challenge.
Yeah.
And make sure that everyone has, at least a basic level of economic security,
Exactly.
even in a world where work is increasingly automated.
Okay. So what other policy solutions were discussed?
Another area that got a lot of attention was the role of corporate governance
Okay.
and the need to hold corporations accountable
Yeah.
for their impact on society.
Right. We often hear this talk about corporations having a responsibility to, be good citizens.
Right.
But what does that actually mean in practice? Well, for one thing, it means making sure that corporations pay their fair share of taxes. We've all heard stories about corporations using loopholes and offshore tax havens to avoid paying taxes.
Yeah.
And that deprives governments of, the resources that they need to fund public services and address inequality.
Right. So it's not just about fairness. It's about making sure everyone contributes to the common good.
Exactly. And beyond taxes, there's the broader issue of what we call corporate social responsibility,
Okay.
which is the idea that corporations have a responsibility to consider the impact of their actions, not just on, their bottom line,
Right.
Wow.
but on society and the environment.
So things like paying a living wage,
Yeah.
providing safe working conditions, minimizing their environmental footprint.
Absolutely. And, there's a growing movement to hold corporations accountable for their social and environmental performance. So, consumers are demanding more transparency, investors are factoring ethical considerations into their decisions, governments are implementing regulations to promote corporate responsibility.
So it sounds like the pressure is coming from all sides.
It is, and that pressure can be very effective in changing corporate behavior.
Okay. Corporate accountability, that's a big one. What else? Anything, any totally new ideas that I might not have heard of before?
Well, one idea that's gaining traction is this concept of pre-distribution.
Redistribution, what is that?
It's the idea of addressing inequality before it even arises.
Okay.
So instead of relying on taxes and social programs to kind of redistribute wealth after the fact, pre-distribution focuses on creating a more equitable distribution of income and wealth from the start.
Oh, so it's about preventing inequality rather than trying to cure it.
Exactly. It involves things like investing in education and training,
Wow.
promoting fair labor practices, making sure everyone has equal access to opportunities
Okay.
for advancement.
It sounds like a much more proactive approach
Is.
and potentially more effective. Instead of, just shifting deck chairs around, you're building a more stable ship from the ground up.
I like that analogy.
Yeah.
And it's an approach that's gaining support, among policymakers, academics, people who recognize that addressing inequality really requires a fundamental shift in how we think about, economic systems and the role of government.
Well, we've covered a lot of ground in this deep dive.
We have.
We've explored Piketty's historical analysis, the complex mechanisms that drive inequality, the potential consequences for individuals, for societies, and a whole range of policy solutions,
Yeah.
from the familiar to the more radical.
And it's a complex issue.
Yeah.
There's no easy answer. There's no silver bullet. But one thing that is clear is that inequality is not inevitable. It's the result of the choices that we make
Right.
as individuals, as communities, as societies.
Yeah. And as we wrap up, I want to emphasize that the fight for a more equitable world is, it's an ongoing struggle.
It is.
It's a fight that requires, constant attention, unwavering commitment, and the courage to challenge the status quo.
And it's a fight that has been waged, for generations.
Yeah.
And it's a fight that will continue, long after we're gone. But it's a fight worth having. We all deserve to live in a world where everyone has the opportunity to thrive, regardless of their background or circumstances.
That's a perfect note to end on. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into inequality. We hope this has given you a better understanding of this complex and crucial issue and inspired you to think about the role you can play in creating a more just and equitable world.